Well, I was really looking forward to a climax to the whole search for Ixus Nagas during this issue, but sadly it doesn't look like it was meant to be. While the climax gets started, it unfortunately doesn't really conclude here. Instead, a lot of what we're going to be seeing today is meeting another character who has never appeared or been mentioned before, who is astronomically important to the lore and backstory of this world. Today we are going to learn, in extreme detail, who is Nate Morgan. The cover is very busy on this issue. Not bad, but there's a lot of stuff pushed onto it and it looks busier than it is because it once again uses that old trick of making the characters transparent on the front to let us fully appreciate the sepia-toned flashback background behind them, with Nate Morgan being made the most prominent character on the cover. Appropriate, given that the entire story in this issue is focused on him and his backstory, but still, it feels like a weird choice. Sonic and Tails also look a little bit weird too, not just because of the whole low opacity thing either. Just like, I don't know, the angle we're looking at them at looks kinda strange, and the way that Tails' mouth looks here, it just looks a bit on the strange side, like it's dripping off his face. Nagas, on the plus side, is suitably menacing, even if it looks like he's going to split his head in half if that grin gets any wider. We open on all of our heroes gasping out Nagas' name, revealing that Nate knows who this particular character is before Nagas delivers an ultimatum to Sonic and friends, that if they leave him be and let him see to his affairs, he'll let them live. Nate is quick to point out that Nagas is in no position to bargain with anyone, pointing out that he snuck in by using his elemental magic to sneak in via Eddie's flame arm, which is the only way he was able to get past the mystic wards around the palace. Sonic, Tails, and Eddie are all quick to try and attack the wizard, but Ixus casts some sort of spell that starts to choke all three of them. Nate thinks to himself that Nagas is using his magic to literally suck the oxygen molecules out of the air, basically causing them to suffocate before pulling and tossing a power ring towards Nagas. The wizard leaps for it straight through a fake stained glass window to the outside, revealing that the ring itself was just a hologram anyway. At last, after taking a moment to recover, everyone introduces themselves to one another, Sonic pointing out that he's Jules' son, but he's also pretty curious how Nate would know his father, or Ixus for that matter, considering he's an overlander, and overlanders and Mobians haven't exactly been on great terms since the whole war started. And Nate, while hesitant, decides that it is time to tell someone about his history, and strap in folks because we are in for one hell of a ride. Nate Morgan worked as a geophysician in the overlander city of Megalopolis, alongside Robotnik back when he was known as Julian Kintabor, where they developed the prototype power rings as a potential replacement for fossil fuels. However, due to Robotnik's lack of foresight and thought, Nate is blamed for a rather damaging disaster that took place due to the prototype ring breaking down. Since there was no loss of life, Nate was merely exiled rather than executed, and was basically ready to essentially commit assisted suicide by wandering into Mobian territory, but the king at the time, King Frederick, extended a hand of friendship to him, allowing him to live in the kingdom of Acorn, where he even became something of a godfather to a very young King Max. And with their assistance and access to a Chaos Emerald, he was able to perfect the power rings, leading to a new age of prosperity for the Mobians and helping to lift them out of their pre-industrial state. Heralded as a hero, loved by the community, and responsible for one of the greatest energy sources the world has ever seen, Nate was ready to retire to pursue teaching, helping to pass on his knowledge to the next generation, including a young Jules and Chuck Hedgehog. However, Ixus Nagas, during his time as a court magician, saw Nate's science as a threat to him, and when he couldn't convince the king and queen that Nate was a threat, he teamed up with warlord Kodos, taking advantage of his innate hatred of overlanders to convince him to help. To that end, Nate, Kodos, and a contingent of Kodos' soldiers end up running into a lost group of overlanders, or generic anime protagonists, it's tough to tell, and a fight breaks out between them, with only Nate and Kodos surviving. Despite Nate's insistence, Kodos and Nagas point the finger at him, trying to blame him as the one who brought the soldiers into their territory. and King Max, being the easily manipulated jerk that he is, decides to actually entertain the idea that someone he's known since he was a child just might be an Overlander spy, according to a paranoid magic user and a bigoted warmonger. Rather than wait for any sort of judgment and feeling old wounds reopen, Nate decided to just leave of his own accord, essentially exiling himself, ending up stumbling into the hidden grotto that would eventually become Knothole, leaving behind the ring forge technology in a lake, mostly to keep it out of the hands of folks like Nagas. After that, he ended up trudging for months, until he ended up all the way in the southern tundra, where he finds Eddie, in a much more flesh and blood looking form, about to go over a cliff. Despite his wish to not involve himself with anyone else, fearing he'll cause more problems, he can't just stand by when someone else needs help and ends up saving Eddie, leading to the two of them becoming good friends. They even went out and built this entire castle themselves. Yep, just the two of them, in the frozen wastes. Sure, okay. Sonic points out that they now have some answers to riddles they've had for years, but it still doesn't answer why Nagas would be after him now, after he'd already been cast out of the kingdom. Nate states that originally it was because Nagas was worried that his science would replace Nagas' magic, but now Nate has something that the wizard wants for himself. And he leads Sonic and Tails into a room where a massive collection of power rings is floating, suspended in midair. So this is where the story starts to take a little bit of a downturn, as we spend the entire thing learning about Nate Morgan and how important this single character has been to the backstory of this world since before the story even began. And it's just way too unbelievable and convenient for me to take seriously. Here we have a single character who is an incredibly brilliant scientist, probably even beyond Robotnik's level of genius, who not only had a direct personal connection to Robotnik and King Max and his family, but was also personally responsible for the invention of the power rings and was deeply intertwined with both Nagas and Warlord Kodos' backstories as well, and was also a teacher and friend to Sonic's father and uncle. I'd be more inclined to cut this some slack if we'd had some hinting about this in the past, any sort of hinting at all, but Nate Morgan was not mentioned at all up to this point in the story. And to be fair, a part of this is the fault of the medium itself. This comic was, after all, not really envisioned to have lasted this long, and it's changed quite a bit since it started. And a lot of its earliest contributors, particularly its writers, are no longer working on it. Thus, we have Carl Ballers, who at this point is still relatively new on the title, already providing a major shakeup, but in probably the worst way possible. The story itself was just boring anyway. In what is supposed to be the big climactic clash between Sonic and Tails and Ixus Nagas, the action is pretty much brought to a complete standstill to immediately give us all of the relevant history on this single character, aside from a brief fight scene at the front of the story. Come to think of it, that's a scene that just shows off so far how weirdly inconsistent Nagas' abilities are. When he first appeared, he could form crystals, and could turn those who were in the zone of silence with him into crystals as well, but it was implied that was the extent of his abilities, save for some other parlor tricks, and that he was trying to bluff his way into intimidating others. But this entire arc has shown him being able to teleport, astral project, and control certain elements, even giving him some particularly dangerous abilities like being able to make the air unbreathable. I mean, it at least goes a bit further to make him into a credible threat, but his magic has been pretty ill-defined from his introduction. And most writers will tell you, if you're going to deal with magic in your story, there should be some sort of rule set to govern how it works. Otherwise, you run the risk of allowing it to be far too overpowered. The artwork in this issue is all over the place. It's fine for the most part at the start, but the Overlander designs vary from usual Archie Sonic fare to really weird-looking anime characters that look like they jumped straight out of one of those how-to-draw manga books. The art between the flashbacks looks fine, which makes sense, it's the same art team as before on this, but the background characters, of which there are quite a few in this issue, don't look like they were paid a lot of attention, and they clash a bit when compared to our central characters. Well, that was disappointing, and my enthusiasm for this story has diminished greatly at this point. Maybe, hopefully, the end is actually in sight for when we reach the end of the following issue. But before we get there, we have ourselves another backup story, and since Ken's Secret Service team is currently making their way over to the Knuckles books, we have to focus on someone else. So why not a pair of characters who have been pushed well beyond the background to the point where they've basically been behind the curtain? Yep, in this backup story, The Library, we'll be focusing on Amy Rose and Dulcie the Dragon. To be honest, how many of you had forgotten these characters existed in Archie at this point in time? Anyway, Amy has been exploring some of the more ruined and still desolate buildings around Mobotropolis and has come across a book, which she shares with Dulcie, who happens past the building. The book in question mentions a great dame named Kirby, a storyteller responsible for writing out some of Mobius's greatest legends. Well, that name sounds familiar. Anyway, the book itself mentions that an entire collection of Kirby's stories were donated to the Mobotropolis library for safekeeping. And while Dulcie worries that Robotnik might have destroyed the library and its contents, the two remain hopeful and fly off to try and find it. We actually spend quite a bit of time with the two of them just traveling through the city, flying over the desolate and stained streets that still haven't been properly cleaned up, even after what I can assume has been a while of the Mobians retaking Mobotropolis. After a full page or so of this, they land at the library, still relatively abandoned after all this time. Inside, it doesn't take long before they find a relatively thick book written by Kirby, referred to as the D-Man. But before they can actually look around more, the sound of an opening door catches their attention, leading them to think that someone else might be in there with them. Rather than just, going to find whoever's there and speak to them, they decide it's time for them to leave, but say they'll return with others once they've told everyone else what they found. And we close off on a bookshelf swinging open, a person in shadows asking if anyone is there. This is weird. I'm not sure what to think of this one. I mean, it's supposed to be the start of another string of backups, obviously, and it's harmless enough, and I'm rather happy to see Amy and Dulcie given a bit more screen time, but other than establishing that libraries exist and a weird out-of-nowhere shout-out to Jack Kirby, this was a pretty nothing start to the story, and I think my big problem with it was that they barely spend any time around the library before they just leave. And they leave without meeting whoever was behind the bookcases. It just feels like an unnecessary separation to me. What was wrong with, say, cutting out the page and a half of them traveling to the library, having them wander around a bit, maybe even be spotted by the mysterious figure, and then meet up with whoever it is at the end of the last page, thus giving us a nice little cliffhanger to lead us into the next chapter of the story. Again, there's nothing wrong with it per se, it's a decent if somewhat slow start, so maybe I'll have to withhold judgment on this one until I see a bit more of it. At the very least, I'll say the artwork is a bit better than the main comic, helped quite a bit by Art Mawhinney's penciling work, with Kin inking and coloring, and I will say I do think he does a good job here. Whenever he's doing art beyond just coloring, I tend to be a bit nervous, but to my eyes this looks pretty fine. Though the character outlines look a little bit thick at times, but other than that, not much to complain about. The backgrounds are pretty good this time around too, really capturing how dingy and dirty the city still is, showing that there is still a lot of work to do, probably not helped by the king's insistence on secrets and consolidating his power, honestly. But that's just speculation on my part. It's a simple story, and I don't have a lot to say about it beyond that. Next time, something more exciting will happen during that backup story, and maybe we will actually for real see the conclusion to Sonic and Tails' struggle with Ixus Nagas. One can only hope. I'll see you next time, everyone.